I'm Mike Lyons, Director of Public Policy for Audubon, California. With me are Michael Cohen. I'll be speaking primarily about birds and the importance of the site to birds and the overall ecological impacts and how that connects to the communities and also what that can mean for some of our opportunities there. Michael Cohen will follow me. He'll speak about the action and the costs of inaction. And Kim Delfino will touch on really the role the board can have in this to make sure that we go forward. I love this picture because it reminds what a destination Salton Sea is, and it remains a destination for people as well as for birds. And it's a vital place for birds. It's an area of what's been designated as an important bird area of global significance. We've heard already, and I think I can't say it any better than what the speaker said before lunch about how it's a crown jewel for people and for birds. Over 450 species and subspecies have been found there. And while some people tend to think of it as an accident, it's actually a vital part of the Colorado River Delta system and now serves as kind of a replacement habitat for much of the habitat that's been lost in the Delta. I'll remind you that in California, we've lost about 95% of our wetland and riparian habitats, areas that these birds would rely on if the Salton Sea weren't there or were changed. And as the sea shrinks, we're going to continue to see challenges. We've all heard about the die-offs, the massive die-offs, and this is what we can expect in the future. By some estimates, in 2 to 3 years, the sea will be too saline to allow the fish to continue to live. And so that means further massive die-offs, and if it's bad for the fish, it's also bad for the birds, for many of the bird species, and it's bad for the people. These are just some headlines from the recent years about the strong odors that have come from the sea, and that picture down at the bottom is actually a field tech working along the shoreline, which is just a broad covered with decaying fish carcass and skin and bird feathers and bones, and a really grim sight and a major air quality problem and quality of life problem for the people that live around there.
Definitely the headline of the year.
Yeah.
That one.
Yeah, the rotting balls of fish flesh sounds like some kind of horror movie. And I think it's overall a reminder, again, that what's bad for birds is also bad for people. And I think what we want to really emphasize today is that there's a real connection between the air mitigation efforts and the restoration, and we can do that in ways that benefit birds and also benefit people. And I think that's going to be the primary driver. And I think we've talked to IID and others about this, and we're all pretty much on the same page. And so we're very hopeful about that particular progression. We just want to make some progress now. I have several bird pictures, and I'm just going to gloss over them, but I wanted to touch on just how important it is. This is 90% of North Americans' eared grebe populations can be found at the Salton Sea. The double-crested cormorant, about what's one of the largest breeding colonies for the double-crested cormorant. Perhaps one of the most iconic birds is the white pelican. 30% of the North American breeding population can be found there. And this, like all the other birds I'm going to show you, not only have suffered because of loss of habitat overall, they're going to face immense challenges with climate change. Each of these birds has been identified by the National Audubon Society as being threatened in its future by losing some or even almost all of their ranges due to climate change in the future. And what that means is for birds like the Caspian tern, which is already undergoing intensive management elsewhere in its range, that you need places like the Salton Sea that can be strongholds for management of it. And again, with a restoration plan, the Salton Sea can remain a stronghold for these kinds of species. The ruddy ducks, I want to bring this up because Salton Sea is immensely important for waterfowl of all types. It's important to birders, it's important to hunters, it's important to people who just like to look at ducks and feed ducks. And we're talking about 50% of the Pacific flyway population, or 32,000 birds, but we're talking also about teal and mallard with immense values. I wanted to bring up shorebirds quickly because the long-billed curlew is a species which already sees immense challenges on its breeding ground, and we need to protect wintering grounds like the Salton Sea for this species, and Salton Sea is one of the largest populations, so that they're stronger and more robust and able to deal with the challenges on their breeding grounds when they go back. And the Salton Sea is immensely important to many other shorebird species that are dealing with the similar kinds of challenges. One of the reasons we also want to bring up the shorebirds is that we've already seen at Owens Lake dust mitigation measures that are incorporated with restoration and habitat creation that are flourishing for birds with using very little, relatively little water compared to some other proposals. At Owens Lake, they've reduced particulate air pollution by 95% with about 100,000 acre-feet per year of water over 100 square miles. And we figured out how to control the dust and provide habitat with 50% less water. So there are lessons out there already and models to go forward, and we think we can do that more efficiently perhaps than we've done already. I'll just end on a snowy plover because it's an amazing bird. And this is also one of the most important inland colonies for this particular species. And I want to underscore that while we're talking about birds, it's really about, again, what's good for birds is what's good for people. And I think we have to be driven by what we can do for the communities and understand that a vibrant Salton Sea means that we have good wildlife habitat and that we're supporting the communities and the ag and all the other activities that are there that are part of a mosaic. The birds themselves rely on that mosaic, not just the sea, but the ag and the other activities around there. And so we want to work as part of a holistic solution, and we think we can do that expeditiously. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the pictures, too.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Madam Chair, members of the board, and also like to thank your staff for helping us overcome some technical and logistical challenges, but it all went smoothly and here we are. If we can have that first slide pop up, or I just point this somewhere and magic happens. Anyway, so as we pointed out in our comment letter, this is a very timely and appropriate workshop, but not just because of the Salton Sea itself and the tremendous ecological and public health impacts, which I'm going to describe in a moment, but I think it specifically addresses this question that you discussed yesterday about drought and how California addresses drought. And of course, one of the major tools in that kit is water reallocation. But people may in the future look to the Salton Sea and say, does water reallocation work? Do transfers work? Are the externalities actually addressed? Or as other parts of the state are encouraged to reallocate their water on a permanent or short-term basis. So they look south and they say, well, this is a failure. Transfers are a failure, and we're going to hold on to our water, and you guys have to go somewhere else to find your water. So I think we need to look at this as a statewide, and in fact, as was mentioned earlier, really a basin-wide, not just California, but the Colorado River Basin issue. How do we move water on the basin? How do we meet growing human demands while still meeting ecological demands and protecting human health? And a lot of that really is concentrated here at the Salton Sea. And so whether this fails or doesn't fail is really maybe a good guideline for how we move forward. So I've been working on this, sadly, for 17 plus years, and used to have Mike's hair, but I've lost it.
It's just yesterday. Weren't you two the ones who first explained this issue to me?
We tried.
Late night.
You got it. The state got it and said this is a major problem, and we're still working on this. So I've been working on this for too long. So I put out a report about 6 months ago, which I think was attached to your letter, and I think has been referenced previously. And I'm going to speak to that. That's really the basis of my talk now, to provide this broader context. And really, it's this challenge of who pays. And in some ways, it's the state that pays. Will the state meet its obligations for mitigation and to undertake restoration at the Salton Sea? The state as a whole, or as we've heard, is it the people of California, particularly the Imperial and Coachella valleys, and frankly, the people across the border in Mexicali, will pay that. So somebody's going to pay. It's just a question of who, and what those larger implications are. So we saw, this is a graph on a previous report when I was trying to describe really the ecological implications of inaction at the Salton Sea. So this kind of yellowish, whatever color that is, on the left is where we are. That red X essentially is where the Salton Sea is now, about minus 234. And essentially that's what was projected. That's what the board assumed would occur. And as Dan Denham mentioned, there are other impacts affecting the Salton Sea currently causing the elevation of the Salton Sea to decline. So that's the trajectory we're at. But what happens is this period of rapid change, this 10 to 12-year period, where essentially the salinity at the Salton Sea triples. The elevation of the Salton Sea drops by 20 feet. So we can point to very specific elevations there or salinities there and say, well, look, there's Mono Lake, and there's a very active and productive spot for visiting birds. It's biologically productive. But the change here, the difference here is that it's the rate of change. And I would submit that the rate of change here is really too rapid for species to adapt before the salinity continues to increase, and they're unable to thrive in that condition. So what we're going to see from that is essentially an ecological catastrophe. So as Mike just mentioned, with all the birds, that has direct implications for food resources for these birds. The fish die off very quickly. But of course, that then generates additional odors and has economic impacts, which I'll mention in a second. So this is a different way to look at it. We've seen different variations of this. Part of the challenge that Kevin Kelly mentioned about what's the total exposure is really what do we determine as the baseline. So this particular map looks at the baseline of essentially the pre-QSA condition. So this is minus 228 in the blue. Light blue essentially is where we're already at. And then this kind of tomato soup color is where we're projected to be as the Salton Sea continues to decline. Now, I would point out that...
What's the time frame?
So this is essentially that is in about 20 years. So the Salton Sea when it goes through this very rapid decline and then more or less restabilizes at about in roughly 20 years. Again, it depends on what the inflows are. Salton Sea directly reflects inflows. And there's some uncertainty as to what those inflows are. The state process previously looked at a variety of different inflows. This is, you could say, more conservative end, but that still means 700,000 acre-feet of water flowing into the Salton Sea every year, which is a tremendous amount of water to work with. It provides tremendous opportunity for mitigation and restoration. So unlike a lot of our restoration challenges in the West, where there's no water at all, San Joaquin River is dry, you've got to get water to put it in the river, there's 700,000 acre-feet of water going to flow into the Salton Sea. The challenge to us is how do we manage that water? How do we optimize that water to generate the most ecological value, which we can do, and how do we minimize those dust emissions, which we can also do. So we heard a little bit about projects on the ground. One project that hadn't been mentioned was a project developed by USGS and Bureau of Reclamation. It was a 100-acre wetland, essentially constructed on the dry. So there's a difference there, but it was constructed on the dry. They essentially put water on very shallow berms, tremendous biological productivity, huge bird numbers. In fact, there are huge numbers of desert pupfish, which created some problems for Department of Fish and Wildlife. But sadly, the state decided it was not going to continue to fund that and dried it up. So that's part of our challenge is that we have good projects. We've seen that these things can be effective on the ground, but sometimes there's differing priorities and we don't maintain some of these projects. So this is dust emissions. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about this. There's, again, a great deal of uncertainty as to how much land's going to be exposed, but how much dust is going to be emitted from these various lands. But potentially 100 tons of dust per day, as much as 60 to 70 of that could come directly because of QSA exposure. Again, we heard earlier about health impacts. There's a variety of health impacts, typically affecting predominantly poor and vulnerable communities. We heard a little bit about the hydrogen sulfide emission. So when this ecological collapse occurs, not too far off, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when this really starts to occur, occasionally that wind blows north to Rancho Mirage. We just heard earlier today about the tennis tournament, 400,000 visitors. Well, so there's direct economic implications. So if hydrogen sulfide is blowing north during the tennis tournament, my guess, and I'm going out on a limb here, is that people will be less excited to go. 120 golf resorts in Coachella Valley. If hydrogen sulfide is present on a regular basis, people are going to be less likely to go, which means property values decline. So in fact, around the Salton Sea, property values are much lower than you typically see around lakeshore property. In fact, they go down. So we're already seeing what's called a disamenity value directly associated with the Salton Sea, but that's going to spread. So there are public health implications, there are property value implications, which broaden into general economic implications. But I think of greatest interest, and we heard that from some of the beneficiaries of the water transfer itself, is that there's water reliability implications for the state of California as a whole, because as we heard, if this transfer fails, there's going to be a lot of pressure, I think, on your board and on the state of California as a whole to revisit this transfer. And I would argue that it's much easier to get out in front, which under the board's guidance should have been done 13 years ago, but needs to be done out in front. So we've heard previously from San Diego that they're meeting their mitigation responsibilities, which is absolutely correct. But the difference is in 3 years, that mitigation water goes away, and they will have met their mitigation responsibilities. But the state will not have met this broader planning responsibility. And we heard heard mentioned by the state that they were in this process of looking at funding and looking at planning as though this were just another project on their plate. But as we heard at the beginning from Director Kuhn, the state assumed responsibility. So this should be a priority. We have not heard from the state that this is a priority for addressing the broader water needs of the state of California. So I'm a little over time here, so let me just.
Sure, yeah,
So let me Kim's a fast
I
talker.
want to hear Kim's the one who's going to focus on.
So this is in my report. I'll leave this, but the cost can be quite high. And I think the balance is who pays for this? Is it the state of California to help preserve not just the health and welfare of the people of California and the ecological resources, but water reliability for the state of California as a whole?
I don't have any slides. So good afternoon, and I will try to speak very rapidly, but I will not do it in 19 seconds.
Right.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank the board for holding this workshop. I think that the comment was made earlier, I think by Chairwoman Marcus, that it would be nice to have had the board check back year after year, starting 13 years ago, but that didn't happen. That's fine. We are here now, and we really appreciate the fact that that's happening. I think that, 13 years ago, Mike Cohen and I, as well as a number of other people probably behind me, came before the board on the water transfer. And as you've heard, and we made the case at the time that this transfer was going to rapidly accelerate the decline of the sea, and that the Salton Sea was an issue that had to be addressed in the water transfer, which many parties resisted at the time, but we were successful to the extent that the board, given its public trust and public resource responsibilities, gave the sea a 15-year reprieve and required that 15 years of mitigation water would be delivered to the sea, and in that time, the parties would hopefully come together and figure out a plan for moving forward for addressing the impacts of the transfer and for what the future of the sea would look like. That wasn't enough to close the deal. It took another year and it was a failed vote before the IID board and a lot of other things that I won't go into that caused the parties to come back together again and reach the deal as Supervisor Kuhn mentioned, which was that the state stepped in to close the deal and said, we realize that the impacts of this transfer might be quite substantial. And we realized that the water parties that were involved had only a certain amount of funds that they were willing or capable of inputting into as mitigation. And the state stepped up and said, we will be the insurance policy for the Imperial and Coachella Valley and their communities, that in the event that the money was not enough, the $133 million that was originally committed, the state would be the backstop. And that was litigated, and that was upheld, and that is the state's obligation. The state also said that they had an obligation and committed to restoring, and I use the word in quotes because I think it's clear that we're not going back to the postcard that Mike Lyons put up in the beginning of this presentation, but that the state had an obligation to come up with a plan for how to manage the Salton Sea and all of the resources and public health issues that were associated with it. And mitigation is a part of that, and should be a part of that, and it should fit together so that we're not stranding assets or resources or doing projects that 5 years from now we're going to have to abandon because they don't fit into what is a more reasonable or sustainable vision for the sea. So that's why I'm here today, because we took those commitments by the state very seriously. And for the last 13 years, we have been appearing before various hearings and boards and proceedings and writing comment letters and testifying and providing input and working in collaboration with the hope that a plan would come together. And that while some progress has been made, not enough has been made. And we are only 2 years away from mitigation water ceasing to be delivered to the sea. And the sea will recede rapidly, and a lot of land will be exposed rapidly. And that's because the sea is a very shallow body of water. And we will see the impacts. And I think the Sierra Club students got up and I think very eloquently put a face on who the people are, the communities who will be affected by this. And I think Mike Lyons was very, very clear in this. We're not here just because we care about birds or we care about fish or we care about, the critters out there. We're here because they represent the larger part of what is that community and the impacts that they're going to have to bear. And I think the state board here has a unique and important role to play. You approve the transfer, and you have ongoing jurisdiction and responsibility over this matter, as you noted in your order back in 2002. If the state does not provide a plan for how to live up to its obligation and identify at least a path for moving forward to paying for those obligations, this transfer is in jeopardy. Particularly when the dust storms start, the birds start dying, the smells start wafting, and people, particularly children and elderly, start crowding emergency rooms because of the breathing problems. I'm here to urge you to step up and use your powers to move us forwards towards a solution for a sustainable sea. And I use the word sustainable very carefully because sustainable in the dictionary is to be able to use resources without destroying or completely using them up. And what I'm talking about is managing the system that we have and doing it in a way that does not cause ecological disaster. It will be a smaller C. And that was something we'd said earlier in 2007, back when the Resources Agency came up with their plan. We knew the $9 billion plan wasn't feasible, and we urged them to take a more measured approach, but they didn't, and now we're here where we are. And we need the board to step up and assert its jurisdiction and herd the cats. I would recommend that you do convene a series of workshops and include the Resources Agency in that, along with all the other stakeholders and parties, to come up with a plan within the next 6 months. We don't have a lot of time. I feel like after the state got up and made its presentation, there was a certain lack of urgency in what was being stated. We don't have any additional time. I would also ask that you ask the Resources Agency to provide a funding plan within the next 6 months of how they're going to live up to their QSA obligations. They don't have to provide the money up front and put it in escrow, but they have to at least show us some idea of where we're going to be going with this. And we believe that the board is the appropriate convener and overseer for something like this. Some have suggested that the governor appoint a task force, and I'm here to say that the time for a task force is long past. We have already spent 13 years in various iterations of what would be considered a task force, and we don't need another one. We need an entity with real legal authority over the water transfer to step in and get serious about what's about to happen at the Salton Sea. And you guys, you are that entity. And the time to act is now. You issued an order 13 years ago that approved the transfer with the understanding that the public trust and public health issues would be addressed. And for more than a decade, California has had the benefit of the QSA and the water transfer. The time has come for the board to step back in and make sure that the Salton Sea, its surrounding communities, and fish and wildlife have the corresponding benefit of the state's commitment to ensure that the water transfer won't create an environmental and public health disaster. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Do any of you see the Salton Sea Authority? What role do you see for the Salton Sea Authority?
The Salton Sea Authority was provided funding recently by the Resources Agency. They very much have a role to play here because they are a JPA that was created with various, the different boards of supervisors and IID sit on that authority, and it's a good place to try to have some of these conversations. But they are not funded, and they don't have the jurisdiction over the water transfer, and they have been convening these conversations for 13 years. So I think that the locals, this issue is a state issue, but it has local impacts, and so yes, they have a role to play. But I don't think that they have the sole responsibility here. And I do feel that various interests have been stepping in and trying to serve a role, but the board has jurisdiction here. The board has an ongoing enforcement obligation, and I think that you guys have the power to focus people at a time when we absolutely need people to focus.
I'd like to thank you for your comments. I think you provided some very useful suggestions. And I appreciate that you're tempered in your expectations, saying that the $9 billion plan was just never feasible to begin with. But between the Salton Sea Authority and resources, it looks like they're coming up with a process to move forward. It may not be what you're looking for and in terms of immediate action, but could you comment on the 3-phase plan that the Resources Agency talked about?
I think that the Resources Agency, the first phase was they already spent some money and put grants out for 3 small projects. That's fine. The second phase was how we're going to spend the bond funds, which they have to do anyway. And the third phase was the actual plan, which should have actually been the first phase. And so I think because, again, and this is an issue with the species habitat complex that they showed you up there with the various cells. That project started out several years ago, and it is now only able to fund about 300 acres. I think that the state has done the best that the Resources Agency has done a pretty good job But they don't have the authority over making sure all the parties get together and move forward. And what the plan that they put forward to you, they even admitted themselves the projects that they have won't even break ground, if we're lucky, till the end of this year. That would be one project. At the point I'm trying to make to you is that, and when asked about the air quality issues, I don't think that question was ever answered. So I think that that's the point, is they've been very focused on trying to dealing with some bird and fish issues. And this is a much broader problem that we have to address. And this is the issue of also mitigation. We use this word mitigation and restoration sort of interchangeably. The point I'm trying to make is the state has a mitigation obligation. That is a big obligation they assume to close this deal. They also have a restoration obligation. And I think the mitigation piece has been kind of lost. They are supposed to come up with funding when that mitigation fund runs out. And that mitigation fund could run out really quickly once the mitigation water ceases. This is what I'm trying to say is I think there needs to be someone who steps in and takes a broader view of all the various resource issues and health impacts that are going to happen. That the state has done what they can, but they have not quite got there yet in terms of the resources agency.
I would add to that there's a real disconnect between the imminence of the catastrophe at the Salton Sea, which will start essentially in 2018, and the somewhat passive and reactive response that we heard from the state. So the state is saying they're essentially going to wait until the Salton Sea Authority's financing feasibility study comes out in 2016. So that's essentially just a study. That's a framework, another study to say, here's how we're going to start moving forward. But the scale of the Salton Sea, as we heard, is so immense that we needed to start projects essentially 10 years ago. So what we need is this interim plan. There are some short-term projects that are queued up and ready to go, they're essentially shovel-ready. What we need to get from the state is a greater, again, the sense of urgency, but a greater commitment to finding the funding, not to wait for the funding to come down in occasional bond packages, but to go out, work with legislators and say, the state has undertaken a commitment which benefits the entire state. We need to find funding. We need to develop some mechanisms to generate funding so we can get money to these projects that are already permitted so they can be constructed starting now, not waiting 2 years to start looking at a plan to put this together. IID is developing a complementary plan, essentially a midterm plan, which I think can be expedited, but provides, again, a more of a holistic vision, which to date has been absent. How do we put together these different pieces? How do we connect them? How do we develop the infrastructure which will be necessary to get the water spread around to these different projects? What does that cost? And what are the funding requirements to make that happen? So we haven't seen that either. So
But isn't that at heart best done as the collective effort that a lot of people have been talking about?
So
It's not
there's
just the state doing it in isolation, it's the state doing it in concert.
So I guess my response to that is there's a real tension between consensus and leadership. And on one hand, it's important to bring all the stakeholders together and develop the plan. But on the other hand, we're almost out of time, and we need real leadership from the state who has the funding responsibility, the obligation to make this happen. It's focused attention on what happens if we don't make this happen. And that's, I think, where the critical role of this board comes in to say, if you don't meet the obligation, we're going to revisit the water transfer.
Yeah,
That's not something that we suggest. It's not something that we say there should happen, but what should have happened hasn't happened. So in the absence of that, if that second half of the agreement hasn't been satisfied, maybe we put on the back burner the water transfer so that other parties come forward and say, wait a second, this is important to the state as a whole. All the parties go to the legislature and say, we need to find some funding to make this happen.
We just haven't seen a clear articulation of the state's obligation by the state. We've all told the state what we think their obligation is. We've interpreted what Richard Katz had said. This is what's closing the deal back in 2003, and when it was put into legislation. But the state has actually not ever really stood up and owned what that obligation is and what that obligation means. And that's what we're asking for, because we're 2 years away from potential real disaster down there, and we need the state to step up. This is one of those times where, you have an opportunity to step in and try to maybe avert disaster rather than simply respond to disaster, which unfortunately I think you guys, based on your hearings yesterday, probably well know what that's like. It costs time, it costs money, it's going to cost people's lives.
Great.
I think the last point I'd like to just make on that
And
too.
then we'll
yeah,
wrap.
And the
I'm
role,
very
another
conscious
role
of
for the
time.
board that you have is, I think you can provide accountability, for the agencies, for all the stakeholders that are involved. If we're coming to the table and saying we're going to deliver something, whether it's a plan or a project or a partnership, having to be accountable to a body such as yours can help get things done. And I don't think there has been quite that accountability to date. And to be frank, it's made some people lose faith in the process, whether it's the state or some other body is able to actually make progress, and they feel like they're just wasting money, maybe tens of millions of dollars. And I think as we start spending that bond money, for example, there needs to be a high degree of accountability and efficiency for those programs. And I think those are the kind of difficult questions you guys can be asking of all of us involved if we're talking about how to spend the taxpayers' dollars. And I'd really encourage you to really look at that and take an active role there.
Great. Thank you all very much. Very helpful.